So today is day 6. We're going to be going over the types of investigations. Our objective is you will learn about the 3 types of scientific investigations and be able to identify each type by the end of this lesson. The warm-up for today was just review overgoing how to use a metric ruler. Hopefully that is just review. You can view that in Canvas should you need to or if you want to. And here's just a reference guide. Hopefully by now you know that 10 millimeters equal 1 centimeter, and you can measure both. You can measure both on a metric ruler. Once you're done with that, you can play the ruler game. You can access this link in Intro to Science, Day 6, underneath direct instruction. Okay, so when we're going over the types of investigations, usually when you think about science, everyone thinks about experiments, right? And especially when you think about scientific investigations. But there's a smaller scope in the broad scope of investigation when it comes to science. In experimental investigations, experimental investigations are only one of 3 major types. So in science, there are 3 different types of investigations that scientists perform. And we're going to be looking at all of them. But just to let you know, an investigation is a detailed, careful examination of something, object, or event. So the types of investigations, there are 3 types. The first being descriptive investigations. These are used to observe the physical and behavioral characteristics of something. So if I was to observe like a basketball player like LeBron James, I'm just observing him. I could give you a description of him. His physical, he's very tall, very athletic. His behavioral characteristic would be very hype, very focused when he's playing on the court. That would be a descriptive investigation. Nothing changes. I can't control him as a player, right? Our second type of investigation is comparative investigation. This is an investigation that's used to describe and compare 2 or more different objects or events. This is used to kind of show similarities and differences between things. Some people like to compare MJ, Michael Jordan, to LeBron James. You could go all day in and out comparing those 2 players, similarities, differences, even go as to say who's better. That's a comparative investigation. Another example would be comparing, Mars and Mercury as planets. You could go all day comparing the 2, quantitatively, qualitatively. That's just what that type of investigation is. The third type of investigation is the one people are most familiar with. This is experimental investigation. This is a test. This is where scientists comes in where they can prove something, right? You create a hypothesis. It would be Usain Bolt is or is not the fastest man on Earth. At the Olympics, that's where you would determine that. You could prove that hypothesis by having them all race. You could do it multiple times, just like they do and they have. And he has proven that he is the fastest man on Earth. That would prove my hypothesis if I said he was. It would disprove my hypothesis if we said he wasn't. Something changes in an experimental investigation. Descriptive investigation. Here's just more in-depth description of a descriptive investigation. Like we said, it describes the objects or events. Use qualitative, quantitative observations. Remember, qualitative is the quality of something. Using your 5 senses to determine characteristics of an object. Quantitative observation, this is where you're literally counting. It's always some type of number. So qualitative would be kind of like, oh, LeBron James sweats, smells wonderful. I don't know, that'd be something I could smell. I could smell the court. If I'm at the game, I could hear the crowd. I could hear him talking to his mates. His playmates, I can hear him talking to his teammates. Sorry. That's using my five senses. I could hear them, I could see them, most importantly. Now, quantitative observation of that is I could look at the stats for that game. How many free throws did he make? How many 3-pointers did he make? I'd end up with a number at the end of that observation. You're observing to see what happens. You cannot change anything. Nothing changes. I could also put it in a data chart. Comparative investigations. This is describing two or more objects. Remember, if we were describing Michael Jordan and LeBron James, we also could record the differences in their data that we come up with, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. You could observe what happens and compare the two. If I talk to someone who saw them back in the day, it'd probably be like my parents. And I saw LeBron now, we could compare what we saw on the differences of players. We could also have a data chart, right? Again, I forgot. We don't change anything in comparative investigation. We're just comparing two objects. Experimental investigation, this is where hypothesis comes into play. We're testing that hypothesis to support it or disprove it. It contains an independent and dependent variable, something that's going to change or not, and only one factor is changed. All others are left the same. It's a data chart and a graph. You can go on to Canvas and complete the extra practice, guided practice, just to get more a feel of testing your skills and determining what determines, a comparative, a descriptive, or an experimental investigation. We'll actually go over some examples after this in that guided practice. So if you look here, we're going to go over these three types of investigations. The first one, we see a little picture of a microscopic view of an organism we would not be able to see with the naked eye. And what it says is a student used a microscope to observe an amoeba to determine how the organism moved. What type of investigation do you think this is? Is it descriptive, is it comparative, or is it experimental? So, this is actually a descriptive investigation. It's descriptive because A, nothing changes, there's no hypothesis, there's only one organism we're viewing or observing, we're not comparing anything, so we're literally just looking at one thing and describing it. Investigation number 2. A student uses a hand lens to examine the color and texture of 4 different rocks. What type of investigation do you think this one is? So this is actually a comparative investigation. It's not an experimental because nothing changes. We're just looking at the different types of rocks, comparing and contrasting them all by just examining the color and the texture between them. So anytime you're comparing something, it is a comparative investigation. Investigation number 3. A student planted ryegrass seeds in potting soil and 3 plastic cups, placing them on a windowsill and watering 1 daily, 1 every 3rd day, and 1 not at all. What type of investigation do you think this is? So this is actually experimental investigation. Why? Because anytime we put seeds in soil and we water, we know something's going to change. We know that they're going to not look the same at the end, whether some are big, some are smaller than others. There's going to end up being plants in those inside that soil. This could also be a comparative investigation. Why? Because they're determining at the end probably that student's going to compare which one grew, how they grew in comparison of the others. Is one bigger, is one smaller? Are they all the same? Didn't really matter. So it could be both, just letting you know. So just looking at this is a really good tool to use on, especially for review and just reminding yourself what these are. So the purpose of a descriptive investigation is to draw conclusions. When you're studying something, an object or an event, you're trying to determine the conclusion of that event or that object. It looks a certain way, does a certain thing, acts a certain way. You're drawing a conclusion about that object or event. It doesn't include a hypothesis because we're not answering a question. You're literally just observing something, just like the student was observing the amoeba. They're not answering any question, they're just observing it. So it doesn't have, since there is no hypothesis, it's really not an experiment. So there isn't any independent and dependent variables, and it doesn't have a control group or experimental group. Now, comparative investigation, that's to determine relationships, similarities, and differences between two objects or events. Yes, it does include a hypothesis, and so in terms, it does include independent and dependent, because comparing something, you can say it is or it isn't. You can compare two players, one's better than the other, one's faster than the other, and then having a dependent, you're proving it right or wrong. Now, just because you're comparing two things doesn't mean you have an experimental group or a control group. You're just looking at two things, observing, and coming up with the conclusion at the same time. Experimental, you're determining a causal relationship. What's the cause of that relationship? Why? In that third picture, in that student growing the rye seeds, why did one grow more than the other? Probably determined upon how much water he gave it. So it does include a hypothesis, and it does include an independent and dependent variables, and it does have a control group or experimental group. Once you look at those, I want you to go down and really answer these questions on your guided practice. This link, again, is in day 6 under guided practice for extra practice. And choose one, and you can play with that and really challenge yourself. So once you're done with that, looking at that guided practice, I want you to go complete the types of investigation exit ticket. And that exit ticket, you're going to be telling me which type of investigation you would like to look at. And that's not a plant or anything. I want you to tell me you'd rather, if you had the choice, would you do a descriptive investigation, a comparative investigation, or an experimental investigation? And after that, you're going to work on your independent practice types of investigation. Again, access that link in the intro to science, day 6 page. And contact me if you have any more questions. All of this can be viewed in Canvas. Take it easy.